Hi, everybody. Welcome to our incredible 11 a.m. panel. My name is Elizabeth Jarcy. I am with the LD4 Program Committee. I will be chat moderator and facilitator for today's session. I'm hoping that our other facilitator, Victoria Sokari, will join us shortly. She is having technical difficulties. I would like to remind everybody, if you didn't hear the little radio woman, the session is being recorded and it will be available later on YouTube. For questions, please use the chat function and type out your questions in the chat or indicate you'd like to speak yourself by raising your hand during the Q&A portion. We will also be collecting all questions in a Word document that can't be answered and then delivering those to the presenters after the session so they can answer them in the chat at their own pace. So today we will be doing linking the enslaved at Dogue Run Farm with Dina, Herbert, and Lesley Parilla. Milli, toward a community of archives with B Dinesh, and using records and context ontology in these Landadora by Jonathan Hunt. I would like to note, you can see in the session description that there is a pre-recording for Mr. Hunt's session due to time constraints. He's in New Zealand. It's the opposite of 11 a.m. here. He did a pre-recording and put that up along with the slides. You can access those through our session description in Sched. And he will also be available later in the week on Slack to answer your questions. So to get started, I will be handing it over to Dina, Herbert, and Lesley Parilla to discuss linking the enslaved at Dogue Run Farm.
Great, thanks. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Share, present, and I think everybody should be able to see this, correct? I'm going to assume that's a yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So Lesley, you want to get started? Do you want to, should we introduce ourselves? We didn't talk about this.
Sure. I'm Lesley Parilla. I'm the Technical Services Librarian at George Washington's Mount Vernon. And just to give you a quick bit of information, these silhouettes are on the screen are from the exhibit that was done about the enslaved at Mount Vernon. The silhouettes are made to represent specific enslaved individuals who they had enough information to determine at least a limited biographical information and their occupation. So the silhouette is based on their age, description, and what their job was at Mount Vernon. So we thought that was a nice way to represent them throughout the exhibit or the presentation.
Great. And I'm Dina Herbert. I'm one of the SNAC liaisons, SNAC being social networks and archival context. And so I'm one of those liaisons at the National Archives. And okay, take it away.
So to give you some background information, George Washington divided the 8,000 acre Mount Vernon estate into 5 farms that are shown in this map. Mansion House, Dogue Run, Muddy Hole, River Farm, and Union Farm. And our estate historian had created genealogical information based for each of those farms. The information we have for 1799 is there were approximately 317 enslaved at the estate. These are actually divided up into 3 different distinct groups. 153 came from Martha Washington from her first husband's estate. And so they are referred to as the dower enslaved because she didn't actually own them, she managed them, and they went directly on to her husband's descendants. 41 were rented from a neighbor or relative, and then 123 were directly owned by George Washington. Now, George Washington in his will said for Martha to free his slaves after his death, which she did in 1801. One of the concerns was that because these groups had intermarried, there was a very high possibility of families being separated. George Washington's Mount Vernon curatorial staff and the estate historian have spent several years researching the estate's holdings and outside resources to identify references made to the enslaved people owned by George and Martha Washington. This information became the basis of an exhibit as well as a book about the enslaved at Mount Vernon. The information was also used to create an in-house database of names of the enslaved that's available on our website, historical narratives that are used in our digital encyclopedia and other places, as well as exhibit content. Information was often scant, so online description focuses on the few examples of enslaved people for whom enough information could create at least a basic biographical narrative. There's a lot of documentation that was collected on enslaved individuals for whom little is known, and so the description was difficult to put in the forms that are listed here to really make it discoverable by the public. So we were trying to figure out if there were a way to take that information and make it more discoverable. We wanted to bring light to the enslaved people who were owned by one of the most famous families in American history, and really focus on making links between the names and the resources, because the focus of most of these materials that are online is on how it fits into the history. So instead of focusing on the way a lot of the information is available, where it talks about the enslaver and the plantation, really turning it over and focusing on the enslaved, with the hope that once we get an infrastructure and we get that information in place with those links to the primary resources, it will create an infrastructure that we can then reach out to the descendants of the enslaved to add, so that we can create networks of family history of those in the DC area from the time they were enslaved to their family's freedom. So we identified a few specific issues with the description of the enslaved people. They're difficult to uniquely identify in a traditional library standard name string. In most cases, you would have a first and last name, possibly life and death years, or a qualifier for what they did. Often these individuals are only known by a first name. We might be able to estimate a birth year, but often the name that they had, there would be multiple people even on the same plantation with that name. Distinct identification is often only possible through relationships to the enslaver and the plantation. Cataloging rules usually focus on describing the bibliographic resource, not the person. And so there are many cases, I know working in our library catalog, where I might create a record for the person, but because they were one of many enslaved individuals described in a resource, I could not add their name as an access point. And then the last challenge, most of the name authority files are really designed to be used by catalogers, not by the general public. So if you have someone who is really not necessarily easily linked to a bibliographic resource, they're not going to be discovered by general resources. So SNAC answers several of these challenges. The name string creation follows commonly established name authority practices, so it fits well with what libraries and archives are already doing, but the system focuses primarily on relationships. So the information that we have to distinctly identify them fits with how SNAC is designed to operate. It explicitly connects to primary resources. It's designed to be a name authority source, and its interface is intended to be used by the general public. We looked at several other systems in how they might answer the same needs of what we're trying to do with this description. Genealogy programs focus on the relationships, but it's difficult to create a link to primary resources that may be found, say, in Mount Vernon's library. Library of Congress name authority file is a standard of the profession. It's great for creating links to resources, but there's very little focus on relationships to other entities. Wikidata, of course, has a very strong infrastructure, but being used for the general public for research is somewhat problematic. And Wikipedia is great for public searching, but one of the challenges we ran into there was that often in order to create an article, you need to have a lot of description from multiple writers. And so here we have two examples. William Costin was a formerly enslaved person who, once freed, did very well. He was established in Washington, D.C. He has a very extensive Wikipedia page. Caesar was an enslaved person at Mount Vernon, and unfortunately, most of the online, especially the online resources that are available to link to Wikipedia, all come from staff at Mount Vernon. So when I tried to create a page for him, there wasn't enough diversity in terms of publication sources, and so they did not publish his page.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what is SNAC. So as you can see, SNAC, or Social Networks and Archival Context, is a free online resource that creates a documentary social network by linking creators of archival material with the documents. It is a solution to the archival diaspora, since these historical resources are located all over the world. SNAC serves as a name authority for archival material, similar to the Name Authority Cooperative, or NACO, based out of Library of Congress, which is an authority for creators of published work. So currently there are 51 member institutions in SNAC, ranging from large universities and national archives to smaller historical societies and everything in between. So we have members like the National Archives of Brazil, Harvard University, the Getty Research Institute, the National Baseball Hall of Fame, and the Litchfield, Connecticut Historical Society. It is based out of the University of Virginia and the U.S. National Archives. And this is also our plug that if you are at all interested in joining, and if, after this presentation, you think, oh my God, I got to get on board, I got to do something like this, you can find out more information about membership on our website.
So when creating these records, we were relying on 3 primary resources and 2 digital resources that were in place. Our estate historian, Mary Thompson, had created detailed genealogical research in the form of Word documents for each of the 5 farms, and that was really the basis of the initial work. We would also link to Mount Vernon's enslaved persons database. The 3 primary resources were censuses that were done of the enslaved, first in 1786, right before George Washington married. Another one that was done in 1799, and each of these were listed per farm. And then a census that was done of the dower enslaved population that belonged to Martha Washington's first husband. As you can see here, we have an image of, on the right is a 1799 document that's owned by George Washington's Mount Vernon. On the left, the 1786 census is actually a diary entry from George Washington that is part of the Library of Congress collection.
Okay, so sorry, I have to catch up with my notes. Okay, so Lesley and I have been working together on SNAC projects for quite some time, and this was an opportunity to create an edit-a-thon for this underrepresented community with ties to the local Alexandria area where we both live. It is a way to exploit SNAC's linking power and also collaborate with descendants of the Mount Vernon enslaved. The descendants of the Washington families enslaved at Mount Vernon are already involved with activities at Mount Vernon, and this partnership uses their impeccable genealogical work to make SNAC data better. So we began identifying with what information would need to go into SNAC. We'd need at least a person name and a primary source. Then we chose to include the optimal fields like geographic location, link to an owner, and links to other family members in SNAC. And then using RDA and NACO standards, we also included whatever life dates we could find for the individual. Though this project is incredibly murky, our hope is that this is repeatable with other institutions of similar size. Many of America's founding fathers have historical houses and plantations and archival records related to their enslaved, and we'd like this project to be used as a model. So we are working alongside with the enslaved names subgroup within the SNAC operations infrastructure. This group is led by SNAC Director Daniel Pitti at the University of Virginia and Bernita Reed, a project documentarian and oral historian at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Bernita is a longtime genealogist and historian of the enslaved and a descendant of slaves herself. The committee is working on defining how to create the relationships of the enslaved in a respectful manner. Some of the big decisions we had were around plantations. In SNAC, plantations are described as a corporate body, whereas in NACO, they are listed as just a place. Bernita also proposed using the language of owner of and owned by to create the unique relationship between the enslaved people and their enslavers. However, we know this is just one person's opinion. There is no consistent view, even among the descendants, for this terminology. And right now, in the subgroup, we've been having a lot of discussions about occupations and subjects, because were the enslaved doing a job? Yes. Was it an occupation? Was it a job? 17th, 18th century, 19th century, terminology is a little different than what we might use today for some of these, activities. So the next steps for the project were determining the rules, creating the first records, and then expanding on those records. So as this slide explains, SNAC is developing editorial guidance for description related to enslaved people. As these policies are established, we were also creating the first record for the Mount Vernon enslaved in SNAC, or the Dogue Run Farm, I should say, just that small subset in SNAC. For the first records, we started with a shell containing the most basic information, and then we could go back and add in more data. In addition to names, Lesley and I wrote biographical abstracts based on the sources for each individual and filled in whatever additional fields we could find. By biographical abstracts, we really mean 2 sentences, because unfortunately that's all we could create. We don't really have a greater picture of these people's lives because of what records were kept. We created an Excel spreadsheet and a Word document to keep track, and we are appreciative of Google Documents and its ability to share and edit simultaneously and track changes and leave comments for each other, so that we could really, keep the work going on. The biggest issue we encountered, as I'm sure everyone on this call, everyone on this Zoom has encountered at some point, is data entry, that it is time consuming. Not only did we have to enter everything manually, but we also had to find the information. Since we seldom had the birth dates of these individuals, we counted backwards from their ages in the census. Some people also had very common names, and we had to determine, was this the Peg we were reading about in the census and in the diary? Was it her daughter Peggy, a completely different Peg? In the enslaved community at Mount Vernon, there were 11 Pegs owned by the Washingtons, or by the Custis family. Right now, SNAC cannot create relationships automatically. So to ensure the links among family members, we had to edit each sibling, parent, and child, and so on within each entry. We hope later iterations of SNAC that will solve this problem. We anticipate in the future, especially once working with the descendants, we will use OpenRefine for ingest of new data. We also hope to use a widget or OpenRefine to add all of this into Wikidata when it's done, to further link it with other data. Okay, so I'm going to preface this by, I had a little bit too much fun with PowerPoint. This is the first animation I have done probably since high school, so bear with me. I'm going to take you through the process now to see how SNAC can link all of this information together. So we're going to start with the flat spreadsheet that Lesley created. You can see there's very quick information about the families, and we're really using this to sort of track the work that we've done. So we're going to focus on Ben, and I'm noticing my time, and I'm going to run through this as quickly as I can. Okay, so Ben is one of George Washington's slaves. He had 3 grown children from his first wife, Joan, and all of whom, including Joan, who passed away, but all of his grown children were part of George Washington's estate. His second wife, Peg, was a dower slave and owned by, or managed by Martha, owned by the Custis family, and therefore she and all her children with Ben were not freed from George's will. So here is Ben's, a snippet of Ben's SNAC page and his relationships. You can already see that it's easier to search. You can toggle and search relations and so on, compared to the very flat spreadsheet. We're going to look at his son, Billy. Billy was from his second marriage with Peg. So you can see he's the child of Ben and the child, oh, no, I'm sorry. He's the child of Peggy, or Peg here, that we are, I forgot to put an arrow in, and therefore he's one of Martha's slaves. After Martha's death, Billy is then owned by George Washington Parke Custis, Martha's grandson. And here we have, by clicking that link, you would pull up George Washington Parke Custis's SNAC page. Wait a minute. Oh, there we go. Okay, sorry. I must have added. This is why we don't do animation. So here is a snippet of another part of George Washington Custis's SNAC page. And this is his relationships. And again, this is to define that I'm highlighting that he is associated with the Arlington plantation in Virginia. So Custis built Arlington, and you can see an image here from the National Archives. He built Arlington, and it was deeded to his daughter, Mary, after his death. Mary is best known as the wife of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. And Arlington, the plantation, is best known as Arlington House, part of Arlington Cemetery. So this is a plantation and a working farm. But as you can see here from the Library of Congress, it's described as a subject heading as the Arlington House Robert E. Lee Memorial in Virginia. Most places describe this as a memorial, as a house, as the national cemetery, but not as a plantation with enslaved people. So in SNAC, we're therefore able to create the corporate bodies for these institutions and to make the plantation a focus, thus rereading historical documents or reading historical documents differently. Okay, I'm going to go super fast. So right now, we are working with the SNAC we have and not the SNAC we want. One of the biggest sticking points is searching. So in a search field, you can do a simple or advanced search. You can search biographies. You can do a faceted search of occupations and subjects. However, as you can see here from Ben, those aren't consistently filled out, and they're not also, very broad. They're very, very broad. Because, and again, the editorial group and the subgroup is working on identifying the correct terminology. We're really trying to formalize something that is never intended to be formalized. So this is where we are right now and where we want the project to go. For the rest of the year, Lesley and I hope we can continue to address how to get the right metadata out of SNAC. We are working on a form to pass along to the volunteer descendants, since many of them have done their own extensive genealogical research. So using the form and then Open Refine, we hope to collect their data about the enslaved and also later generations to import that into SNAC. So we also anticipate them putting all this data into, all this information into Wikidata to ensure, to enable more collaboration and links, especially among other institutions and other enslaved in the DC area. And so thank you. I have put the slides up on the SCED. It's on the very unhelpfully titled LD4 2001 PDF. But thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. We now have about 10 minutes for Q&A if anyone would like to drop a question in the chat. Okay, our first question is from Ruth Tillman. Does SNAC support any kind of linked data publishing that lets one connect these records elsewhere?
So this is Dina. I can try to answer that. I think so. You have found my very my I'm missing the word. You have found my I'm not so good at the tech stuff. We do allow to export to JSON, and so we can do that. And we are working with potentially as the cooperative grows to work on other kind of linking and sharing and so on.
Great, thank you. Our next question is from Christian Anderson. Any feedback from descendants on the project?
So one of the challenges, as you can imagine, is making sure that before we bring something like this to the descendants, that we make sure that we have a real sense of making sure that the infrastructure is strong and that we have as much information in place to demonstrate what it is that we're trying to do. So one of the things that we're doing before we take that to them is working with a historian and other staff who have been working closely with the descendants before we take it to them. So we're still in the process of working out the specifics of it, but we're hoping to take it directly to them soon.
Very cool. Darnell Melvin would like to ask, is there a public endpoint for SNAC records?
Yeah, so I'll pop the link into the chat, but you can do all the searching under snaccooperative.org, and you can see, you can do a browse, you can do a search, and I don't have like a subset for some of the people we're talking. Oh, I see a Sparkle endpoint. No, because I am still scared of Sparkle. But if you go to snaccooperative.org, you can search for all of those information.
Thank you. And Sharon Willis would like to ask, instead of owner of and owned by, why not use enslaver of and enslaved by?
Yeah, that's a great question, Sharon. I was not in some of the earlier meetings with especially Bernita Reed and Daniel Pitti, and I think so I can't speak to why they chose owner of and owned by. I think, as I said, that it's just so hard to come up with a consensus. So I know that that's what was chosen, and I don't know why. I can potentially get back to you if you're interested, or if you want to send me an email. And as these policies do get made more public, or are not more public, as these policies are finalized, we are going to, of course, put documentation on the SNAC website. So that's a good question. I don't know why. I was not in those conversations.
All right, thank you. Now we have a few minutes left, but I would like to turn it over to my fellow co-presenter, Victoria, and she will introduce our next presenter.
Yeah, our next presenter is going to be B Dinesh. He'll be presenting us on Milli towards a community of archives. So over to you, B Dinesh. So our next presenter will be B Dinesh. He'll be presenting on Milli.
Hi.
Yeah.
Hi. Can you hear me? Yeah. So
We can hear you.
yeah, I'm trying to pull out my slides and can you help me?
Yeah, you should be able to screen share. You look for the
No, I have a problem. I think it's not selecting my other screen. So I have it uploaded. If you can just
okay,
help,
I'll go grab
pull
them.
that.
Just give me a minute. Did you put them in Sketch? Where are the slides, Dina?
Yeah, in my SCAD profile presentations.
Okay,
It's
let
a
me go see if
PDF
I can
file.
find them. If you want to go ahead and start talking while while I look for them, that would be fine.
Mm. So I'll start talking, and so we are a small group of people called Milli. Milli is a collective, and we have and the other group that we are part of is called Janastu. So this presentation is going to be a little story of how we started doing this work, the Milli work. And Milli is about what we say, it's a community, we're going towards a community of archives. And if where we are coming from as Janastu, like in India especially, you probably have about 700 million people, and who are marginalized by literacy, so they cannot read and write, and because of that they don't have a representation. And if you look at the history of people's archives, I mean people's heritage, people's history, you will see that most of the time it's the literates, thank you whoever is sharing, who and in collaboration with traders, who go forward and create this wonderful world that we live in, where most of these, in India for example, the 700 million people are rendered invisible, right? Because they don't have this capacity of literacy. So next slide, can share. So here this is a woman called Daroji Iramma, and she just passed away last year, but she's a wandering storyteller. So she goes around, sings and tells stories, and she could hold inside her about 6 stories each, approximately as long as 1,200 pages. So the point is, these stories will need a way to get into the archives, the people's archives, right? And if you look at any traditional archive, how the objects get annotations like descriptions, if you go to a museum and see a plaque, what you see is there will be a small plaque, a description, whatever, but it's a highly curated thing, and the curation comes from a group of people who have to study mostly literature and come up with it. Okay, so next slide. So what we need to focus on in the scale that we are looking at who all we are rendering invisible, and thereby losing all their interpretations and the histories and the material that they carry through and the stories, is ask the simple question, right? Whose material enters an archive, who uses the archive, who describes the archive, and who interprets the archive. Next slide. So each of these plaques in a museum, for example, has annotations. When an object goes into an archive, let's say a digital archive, those narratives become their descriptors, right? And there is a way to discover. So we are in this cycle of annotation, stories, and discovery. Right? And next slide. So where Milli comes in is we want to kind of bridge this huge gap between traditional institutional archives or collections, well-curated collections, to the people's stories, people's archives. And the way we want to go about it is by connecting an open network of archives, because we first want to recognize that not just one archive has the material to connect to one story here. There could be a lot of archives, similarly from the ground upwards. So Milli basically means, in Icelandic, it means in between. So it's a space between archives that helps you put material in there and make us do this how do you call it, sprinkle stuff that helps this connection. And next slide. So if you look at the great number of archives as these clouds, and then what we want to do is discover. We want to discover, let's say there are Daroji Irama, the storyteller is telling a story, and now we want to discover what is available in these silos, right? And then, next slide. And then we need to look at different descriptions that are there, but certainly contribute to these descriptions from where Daroji Irama is coming from. Right? Next slide. And then let this become sources for further interpretation and narratives to come out as stories from them. Next slide. So I will now take a specific example of not like such a historic event from the past, hundreds of years ago, but from what happened 25 years ago in India. There was a state of emergency in India, and India is a completely democratic country, and in these few years where there was an emergency, which is basically a position taken by the Prime Minister to say that we need to go into fast pace. And so now if you look at this big poster on the road, you will see a lot of photographs, and each of these photographs has text, and there are annotations, right? And then what you see is that it comes from a John Fries collection, right? And it's part of the long emergency media and democracy in India. Okay, next slide. So when you see a photograph like this or an object, right, you would ask simple questions. Where was it taken? When was it taken? Right? And does it bring back memories? Like if you're an older person, what was your experience during the 25 years ago when there was this dictatorial, kind of a dictatorial rule, right? And what would it be to live in that period, right? Next slide. So now John Fries is a historian, well-known historian, and he has a collection that is accepted by an institute, and this is a straightforward thing. So who's John Fries, right? What was he doing there, and how did the city look in those days for him? So now what is important is this process of how an important event, I mean, significant event happened and an important collection was formed, and how it went into the archive that we have access to. Right? Next slide. Next slide. Okay. So, no, previous. Okay. So we are talking about a public space. We are talking about a collection, and there are multiple annotations on this photograph, right? And we did ask our questions. So what is important is like how much of the public space did we capture? So next slide. So a few years later, a graphic novel came out by Vishwajyoti Ghosh. Okay. Now there are two aspects to this. The archival information was looked at, and other information, and a graphic novel came out into a story, and the story was published. Now, if you look at the graphic novel, it's full of annotations, right? Now, what we have to imagine is as a possibility that this novel came about, and these annotations have provenance coming from a number of archives, right? It has links to a number of archives pointing to connections of the origin of certain kind of thing. That's where we get our confidence, and we get a validation. It's a fact check and all that, right? Next slide. So typically in many of these archives, like we'll have one or more of the controlled vocabulary. But if you look at the last line here, we are also interested in seeing how things don't fit controlled vocabularies, right? And it's a huge space. We call it the uncontrolled space of how things flow. Right? But still, when you want to connect to stories coming from the ground, we have to kind of deviate from the controlled vocabularies and keep extending it, Next slide. So imagine that this graphic novel was had a URL, and let's consider this is a very popular web annotation image. So here it's an article from Atlantic, okay, and now you're looking at the graphic novel, and you want to identify a part of it, and you want to connect it to the archive. Right? And there are various ways to do it. First thing is wherever the object is, the Atlantic is, they provide, like Google Docs will provide a way to annotate. But there is a web annotation standard now. Can we use the standard to independently annotate any of the material on the web? That's what web annotation does. Now, what does it mean for that to be possible to annotate an archival object? So if you look at that, then this graphic novel will have a certain image or a text that can be highlighted, and that will be the target of our annotation, right? And I, as Dinesh, or another person, would want to say something about that and contribute material to the archival object. And so this is basically what web annotation does. And we also have the question of understanding why certain annotation came up, right? Is it a suggestion? Next slide. Is it a suggestion that that there is an edit request? Is it just for somebody to bookmark it themselves? And these are web annotation motivations. It leads to certain kind of workflow when that annotation is done. Next slide. Okay, so so for example, somebody might want to add a vocabulary and annotate it, and new stories come out, new things are discovered, and new structures are introduced. For example, the propaganda could be the thing that you want to add as a part of a new vocabulary. Okay, next slide. Okay, now I want to give a little bit demo. Yeah, can you click on the demo link above? Okay, fine. So now what's happening is can you go back and click on the demo link? Above. No, there's a link on the word demo. Sorry. Yeah, thanks. So now, oh, right. So now this is a very rudimentary demo. We wanted to come to a stage to request some of you to do a beta testing for us, but we are not there. But still, I think the points can be made here. So if you can look for maybe word building. Yeah. So it's very simple. All of you are aware of like aggregators, and here there are two archives that are aggregated, and one is the ICAS partner and the other one is NCBS archives. So these objects, when you look for building, can come from any of these things, and some of them can be annotated by institutional people, by outsiders, and with special access, and all this is possible. And if there's an edit request annotation for an NCBS archive, we will have a partnership with them to forward them to the NCBS archive. But if there is a can you click on the first 20-point program? Yeah. So now it's a typical archive with archival attributes, and here the partner is ICAS, and if you scroll down, you will see that many of the things about the archive are unknown, and depending on who you are, you maybe want to contribute to some of these things, right? Or if there's something that doesn't exist, you might want to extend with your own vocabulary. If you can click on the little pen over there. No, next to the about the object, right? Yeah, thanks. So click on, say, the subject. So now you want to say, like, add a new subject called propaganda. Can you type? Yeah. Okay. And make some notes if you want. Okay. The submit button may not work because I have to be demoing it with the key. Okay. But yeah. So, but the point is that oh gosh. Okay. So the point is that we did an extension. We added a new element that was not there, and so this is a continuation. So I will stop the demo here. If you have questions, we'll come back after the talk, and there is a lot more that can be spoken, and our team is also here. Maybe they can all also
if you can hear me, and they made me a panelist. I'm happy to share my screen at my end if that helps you. This is Venkat.
Okay. Okay. Do you want to do it now?
If there is time, whatever. I'm just giving you the option. If you want to continue your demo, I'm happy to do
go
that.
ahead. You're welcome to go ahead and share.
Sure. Okay. So I think, Dinesh, go ahead. I mean, I can just follow
No,
your
no,
instructions.
why don't you go ahead? I will catch up with my slides on this end. Just briefly explain there. Yeah.
So just to follow up on what Dinesh is saying, I guess the point is just to try and make a bridge between the W3C annotations, or at least the framework that the W3C is working towards, and also thinking a little bit more about how archival descriptions can sort of go on a similar pathway. And I'm just putting some random details. And in general, there would be, if you see on the right, we've just been testing these ideas out. And over a period of time, you could imagine that this phrase that says motivation, there are dozens, if I'm not mistaken, more than a dozen plus motivations on the W3C platform. And in a way, one can think of description, which is one of them, as being the element that perhaps covers archival descriptions. And of course, the others that Dinesh had mentioned, which is bookmarking, tagging, commenting, and so on and so forth. So it's a small effort to see if we can sort of merge some of these parts and to get back to what Dinesh said, is to try and sort of work from the ground up to think about whose material is being described, who has access to what an archival description is, and what kind of stories it can foster going forward. So I just wanted to give a sense of that, since I realize that the developer token may not work at your end of it. Thanks for letting me in. Dinesh, back to you.
Okay, thanks. So basically what we are trying to kind of demo in this very small rudimentary thing is how the web annotation that's a standard can now be used and contribute to this interlinking of the archives in addition to what I got started. So if you go to the next slide. Yeah. So what we need to understand about the web annotation thing, if for people who are not already very familiar, right? So first thing is you can annotate for yourself, and you can store it so that these annotations are storable. So it can be, once you annotate, it's available, and you can save it in your own space, like in your own repository or as a file. Or this next thing you have to know is you might just want to share it with Venkat or Dinesh. And when Dinesh gets that as a message, even as a message on Telegram or whatever signal, if you open that, it has all the information to go back to that object and see the annotation that was made. Okay, that's what, this is what standards do, like make it interoperable, right? And then it's easy to also have dashboards that can become mix of then it becomes mix of many of these, my repositories that are contributed. So imagine like it's a small like Mastodon or like a Twitter space where we are all sharing, like instead of as a message, and that itself becomes a collective having its own purpose for the collection. Or it can be public, and there are many such public annotation spaces, especially for text, called Hypothesis. Or very specifically, this collection of annotations can be used for a specific service that can be done. For example, the storytellers need. Now, can you go to the next slide? Okay. So back to this now, we are in a way, suppose I have the audio story of Daroji Rama. Okay. Now, what do we do? How can we connect these two? So one of the things we are working on is how media can be, fragments of the media can be annotated, given structured information, right? And these can be interlinked to existing archives. And therefore, there is not only the interlinking, but there's the extension of the vocabularies that become common and contribute to interconnections. And in turn, this becomes the repository and a way of extending and living and connecting to the other 700 million peoples who are marginalized by literacy in India, and worldwide there are many more, get representation. Okay. So, so that's where I want to stop. Can you go to the next slide? Yeah. So this is just a recap and overview of the Milli process. And what we are after is to use internet technologies to bridge this long ignored way that we are where we are now, where we have come to, going forward to reconnect, and move, not necessarily just keep all the archival and the mainstream information coming from what we call as the literates. In India, Indian will say like the Brahmins and the traders, right? Today's world, it will be the literates, the policymakers and all that, and corporates like Facebook and everybody else. Okay, these people would be the ones who are determining all of our quote unquote knowledge and presence, like existence of the objects and the archives and all that. And we want to go a little bit, move forward from this in recognizing and including other people in our spaces, and other objects that are lost are rendered invisible. And one important thing is to have appropriate vocabulary so that discovery and interpretation is possible. And therefore, the stories will include these things in a first class way. What else do I have to say is please join us. We maybe you're already guessed, like we can use all of your help. Please come give talks in our team meetings or small things. And if you are into the FOSS space, we would love you to join us as a part of the FOSS community in forwarding this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dinesh. Yeah, we've all listened to Mr. Dinesh. And I don't know if anybody has any question to ask. You can put your question on the chat box there so that we throw it out to him. Is there anybody with questions so far?
Well, it could be about technology, it could be about process, it could be about vocabulary, annotations, or whatever. Yeah. And we would learn from your questions. So go ahead and ask.
Yeah, no, nobody have thrown out any question yet.
Okay. Sorry about the initial hiccups. I could not get Zoom. Whenever you made me a panelist, it would throw me out. So I had to re-log in and I could not connect. And
okay, there's a question here from Devon. It says, is there some sort of vetting or review process for the crowdsourced annotations?
Is there a review process? Is that the question?
Yeah, for the crowdsourced annotations.
Yeah, so there again, there are ways. If the crowdsourced annotation has to help mutate some object in the archive, right? The archive belongs to a particular partner, right? And if they need to accept a crowdsourced annotation, there will be that partner's process that would review and accept it. That's the most important thing, right? And what is the other possibility is if it's for a group of people who we are working with the community side, if their stories that are being connected, most important thing is the connection that happened. And then the review process is always coming from the bottom up. because it's people's stories, right? If my village feels okay about this connection, that is crowdsourced annotation that came on their fragment, they just, whatever they understand, they will have the say. Right? It's always the bottom-up way that the curation happens. I don't know if I answered it, but nobody can alter information in an existing archive without the archive people okaying it. So that review process will be done by the archival standards. I mean, the institutional standards or whoever is owner of the thing. So again, to repeat, whether the intent, the motivation was to edit or to annotate as a comment for public, okay, and then it will be the Milli review process, or if it's for your own group, then there will be leading to a discussion amongst the team of in your group. So,
okay.
Okay.
There's another question here from Elizabeth saying, who is participating in the Milli project? Mostly educational institutions or the general public? Who of these groups?
Venkat is here because we just went through this International Archives Week, and there was the burst of participation. So I can answer, but Venkat would be the right person to kind of give the up-to-date answer. So Venkat, do you mind?
I can take a crack at it. Thanks for the question. These are very early days in sort of the Milli project or initiative, and we're learning from a bunch of people. At this point, it's, we've worked with a couple of educational institutions to start things out. So it's nowhere close to being accessible to a general public, if that's the question. But the intent is that it is eventually accessible to a much larger body of people who may not necessarily have access to archival institutions. But at this point, it's starting out as a project with maybe a couple of lone archives or a couple of institutions that will have the resources to help support some of these efforts. So that's where it's at right now.
Thank you.
And last question here says, what kind of outreach do you do towards connecting non-literate communities with these materials?
Yeah, so I mean, that's the most significant end goal, right? So we are doing many things. We are also doing something called community radio in many of the, it's all experiments, right? How do we kind of do outreach and collecting these things? So one way to do it is to go to these historic places. There are tourists coming. There are lots of people living there, and there are visitors who are scholars coming. So what we do is two things. Have done is two things, and we continue, but we can extend it. Is one, we have something called a community radio. So people can come and it's just a Wi-Fi mesh radio. So contribute stories, and these stories go into an archive, and there is their own curation, and it's again curated by small groups of people. If it's food, it's about with some local women, but then they can also, some of all this material is available if you come as a tourist to these spots. So if you let's say go to a museum in this area, and in addition to what is there on the plaque, you can just open your phone and you will see other interpretations that are there for that same object. Okay, so this is one way that we are collecting and encouraging non-literate communities to contribute, and then they just need to publish more than their interpretations on that. It could just be audio. So what happens next is a brief curation of these things, and then it's pushed into this puppet service. Whoever is listening to these things can pause at any time, any moment, and annotate that fragment. They can say, oh, the NCBS archive, John Freeze something, is related to this, or more specific, I mean, but it starts building like this until it kind of connects the two dots. So that's the process right now. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
But the most important thing is it's the non-literate communities are kind of moved so far away from expressing their thing, right? So we need to kind of bring back that process of making these stories, making them expressible to contribute to these stories. Yeah, done. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Mr. Dinesh, for your wonderful presentation. I will continue to ask questions on the Slack channel. If you have any question, we're going to trade out there on the Slack channel. And for the participant, the presentation from Jonathan Hunt is recorded and then it's there in the Slack channel for anybody that has questions that have gone through it and has questions can trade out there also on the Slack channel. Thank you for participating in this session. Thank you all.
Thank you all. Thank you all. Yeah, we will keep answering your questions as the whole team is here too. Thank you.
So there's another question in the Q&A of a question about Milli. Are you using Islandora for Milli? And if so, how's your experience with the platform been?
Venkat, do you want to take it?
I don't think I'm qualified to. So just to say that, no, it's not using Islandora, but I'm afraid I wouldn't be able to tell you details. I mean, it's built from the ground up, so we're experimenting, and I can get a couple of other people into the chat to just explain this in detail. If that's, I mean, depends on how much time we have, Elizabeth.
Yeah, we are looking at a number of platforms, but we think it's a bit early to kind of connect and see the availability of those platforms for our needs. But we hope to get there soon.
Great, thank you so much. Does anybody have any other questions? And just a reminder has been going on in the chat that Jonathan Hunt's presentation was pre-recorded, and you'll be able to find that on Sketch and in YouTube. We will also be posting this session in YouTube for you to watch it again. So any other questions? Okay, if not, I want to thank our presenters from SNAC and from the Milli project. I think it's given us a lot to think about. Again, I'd encourage you to continue the conversation over on Slack and the archives and rare materials channel. And otherwise, thank you all very much and enjoy the rest of the sessions today.
Thank you all again.